Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director for Non-Credit and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. The CGA is currently celebrating its 15th year of preparing global citizens. We do this through our two graduate programs, one in global affairs, and our recently launched MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a variety of professional and personal enrichment courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising. This includes several professional certificates. We will send out a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have about these programs. We have also reserved some time at the end of today's event for questions from the audience. Please submit your questions via the Q&A tool. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to tonight's moderator, CGA Clinical Associate Professor, Dr. Christopher Ankersen. Go ahead, Chris.
Michelle, and thank you all to our audience for joining us today as we discuss a vitally important topic that has significant implications for the quality of democratic governance in this country. 1 week on from the horrifying spectacle that took place in and around the US Capitol, we're keenly aware of the importance of matters related to effective control of the military and of armed force writ large, of white supremacy, of authority, legitimacy, and responsible government. And we should not be shy to inspect the foundations of democracy from time to time, thinking about how they might serve us in the coming years and ask ourselves what kind of shoring up they might require. We at the Center for Global Affairs are happy to facilitate such a conversation, and we're extremely happy to be co-hosting this event with the Clements Center, as Michelle mentioned. Joining me tonight is the perfect panel for our subject. So allow me to introduce the panelists very briefly. Their bios are all available online. We have Dr. Jessica Blankshain, an assistant professor at the US Naval War College, Dr. Jim Golby, senior fellow at the Clements Center. Miss Meg Gilliford is Vice Provost Fellow in residence at Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Danielle Lupton is Associate Professor at Colgate University. And Mr. Daniel White is a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute, a part of the United States Military Academy at West Point. All of our panelists have extensive professional experience and or research expertise with the topics they're discussing, and all of them are speaking in their personal capacity and not of that of their employer. In the interest of keeping things casual and to kind of make things flow a little bit better, we've all agreed to refer to each other by our first name. So why are we here talking about power at the Pentagon? And significantly, the incident that really makes this germane for discussion is that on the 7th of December, 2020, President-elect Joe Biden announced that he would be nominating Lloyd Austin to be his next Secretary of Defense. The announcement was noteworthy for several reasons. It surprised many who expected that Michelle Flournoy would be the nominee. If she had been, she would have been the first woman to fill that post. Secondly, Lloyd Austin retired from the US Army as a 4-star general, having finished a distinguished 40-year career as an infantry officer, with his last appointment being commander of US Central Command. If confirmed by the Senate, he would be only the third former general to take up a position of Secretary of Defense. Moreover, as he only retired in 2016, he would require a waiver exempting him from the statutory 7-year waiting period between retirement and appointment as Secretary of Defense. Since retirement, Austin has served on a number of boards, including that of Raytheon, a defense contractor. And if Austin is confirmed, he will be the first African-American to fill the post. So with that very brief sketch in place, let me go to our panel now with some questions. Let me first turn to Meg. Why do you think the position of Secretary of Defense is so important? What makes it different from other cabinet positions that talking about a single appointment would be so important?
Overall, the Secretary of Defense is unique given the enormity of the responsibilities. In addition to the Title X responsibilities that are laid out in law, which include in general terms, this person exercises the authority and direction and control over 3 military departments and 4 different services, and also does the same for much of the intelligence community, including the National Reconnaissance Office, National Geospatial Agency, National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. But more importantly, I think, is the number of individual United States citizens and individuals around the world who fall under the Department of Defense as workforce. Overall, we have over 1.3 million active duty military members, over 700,000 civilians. And in that, you have over 1,000 installations, whether they be bases, stations, depots, that actually support families and individuals all around the world. So the enormity of these responsibilities is huge. And so that's what makes it so unique. And after at this point, 20 years of continuous war fighting, the Secretary of Defense has become this central node in terms of who individuals know in the United States government with it in terms of a cabinet position. So the individual in that position has a lot of visibility because that's what we've been doing as a country for a very long period of time. So that is what is so unique about the position itself. In that vein, when you're talking about planning, developing, and executing policies that concern the military affairs of the national security of a country, that becomes really important when we've been fighting wars for as long as we have. So that in and of itself is what makes this position very unique.
Great. That gives us a very good picture of why this is different. It's not not like any other cabinet position. But I want to turn to Jim now. Some, Jim, like Douglas Ollivant, have opined that, it's no big deal. Austin's nomination is only a matter of concern for those in whom, in what he calls the civil military guild. What do you think could you outline for us the major civil military relations concerns about the appointment of somebody like Lloyd Austin?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Well, even if you don't know much about the Pentagon, one thing that you probably do know is that there are a lot of generals there. But in the chain of command, there are only two civilians, the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. After World War II, Congress came together and they decided that the President and Congress needed more help with a civilian in the Pentagon managing the day-to-day operations of the Pentagon, being able to solve some of the political challenges they had. And so they created a new civilian position. They put an explicit limit in the law that created that, saying that no one could serve who had been on active duty, who had retired or left active duty within the last 10 years. They explicitly stated that the person should come from civilian life. And they laid out some responsibilities for that individual. One of the first things that they have to do is they have a lot of political responsibilities. That's not something that you necessarily get prepared for when you're serving in uniform as a military officer. You have to manage the largest budget and one of the largest workforces anywhere in the world. You have to manage complicated political relationships from the White House to the NSC to other departments and agencies to Capitol Hill, and you have to balance the people within your force. And the last thing, you have to be one of the people who, on behalf of the administration, explains and defends the policies of the Pentagon. And that's a very political, in many cases, a very partisan position. And, Congress, for a very good reason, decided that that should be a civilian, and that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, another position and they created at the same time, should be a military officer. And so they created these two complementary, one civilian, one military position, and they envisioned very different roles with very different skills. Now, that's one thing. There are concerns about managing the Pentagon. My other broader concern is the way that this is impacting our culture, the way that we're starting to expect that military officers are beyond reproach, beyond question, the way that we're starting to expect to see military officers being involved in our partisan politics, whether that's people like Michael Flynn, whether that's people like in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, having senior general officers serving in very partisan political positions, including White House Chief of Staff. And this is a norm that hadn't been violated for 65 years. So I think it's part of this broader trend of us putting too much stock in the military to solve our political problems. And I think it's a really unhealthy trend that we have to stop.
So you would go a little bit further than saying it's not only the position of SecDef that has a particular sensitivity to this, but actually involving retired military officers in politics writ large. Jess, you want to jump in and maybe add a little bit to what Jim's had to say?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I just would like to build on what Jim said a bit, because I think he highlights two importantly different categories of concerns that CivMil scholars have expressed about the nomination, where the first category are some of the things that Jim alluded to about how well a recently retired general is likely to perform the job in terms of whether military expertise, the type of expertise one develops in rising to those ranks, is the best fit for running the Pentagon overall, whether that comes with the necessary political skills that Jim mentioned to manage that role, those types of questions about sort of the short-term practical performance. But then also, as Jim noted, there's this whole other set of concerns that are sort of completely unrelated to how well Secretary Austin, if confirmed, would perform the role. And those I don't think are necessarily mitigated by Austin doing a good job necessarily, and could be worsened. Those concerns around the idea that appointing a recently retired general, and particularly using some of the arguments that are being made that these are exceptional circumstances and only someone coming from that military background can fill the role right now. Those in themselves, regardless of his performance in the job, harm the civil military norms that Jim was talking about, and risk setting a precedent that military expertise really is required for this job and is preferred to civilian expertise for that role, and sort of reinforcing this idea that Jim mentioned that there are problems with civilian government that can't be fixed without asking someone from the military to step in and save us.
Great. I think that added a nice dimension. Meg, you wanted to come in and maybe comment a little bit?
I did, because I think Jess raises a really good point and extends Jim's discussion a bit. But I do want to add on that this is beyond the Secretary of Defense role. I think it speaks to any Senate confirmed official that we still have this issue in terms of who is military or former military in those roles. And I think a recent piece by Alice Hunt Friend really talked about prior military service being a litmus test for your ability to be, or your, excuse me, not your ability to be, but your qualification to be in those roles. And she warned against it. And I think that is something that is very, very important to remember in this case, that these are civilian roles. And as such, the idea that military service being a litmus test as to whether or not you are qualified for those roles is very problematic. And I think that's something that Jess brought up, and I just wanted to extend that a little bit.
I think that sounds maybe to people who are not part of the Civil Military Guild a little counterintuitive, though, right? That this is a technical field. It has everything, as you mentioned, Meg, from base arrangements to nuclear missile, development, to the movement of troops back and forth, logistical issues. So in some senses, at first blush, it sounds like, hey, this person's been eating and drinking this for 40 years. They've got to be the best person to manage that. They know everything that goes on, either having been a victim of it or a person who's actually had their hand on a button or a lever somewhere along the way. Daniel, you wanted to come in, and sorry, Meg, let you finish off.
I respond to that very quickly. In this role, this is a political role in which you are doing policy, and you are managing resources. You are the CEO essentially of the Department of Defense, and you have staffs for that. There's an entire joint staff where their job is to provide that military aspect, and that's really important. The joint staff is the military arm to which the Secretary of Defense can get that feedback. They don't need to have that expertise. They need to understand strategy, policy, and politics.
Great. Yeah, I think many people would say that really the role of a cabinet minister anywhere is to provide that responsible government as opposed to technical expertise. I know that everybody would like to jump in on this. Let me go to Dan first. Go ahead.
Sure, and kind of going off what Jim was saying, how this kind of breaks the norm of, let's say, something like 60 years. There also needs to be some understanding. You know, when you had General Alexander Haig serving as the White House chief of staff, it was at the height of the Watergate scandal, right? So we were saying, hey, we can only trust the military to use as a shield for partisan purposes and their legitimacy in order to move forward, right? So that's one of the things that we would have to consider. Was that also used in the same wake when you had Jim Kelly, as he was used for the White House chief of staff that was talked about? And then when you go to Secretary Mattis, you know, one of the things that we have to understand is when former generals and really former officers writ large at senior levels are chosen for positions, do they understand their oath? When you're a political appointee, you're not serving the country. First, you're serving the president and their particular policies. And one of the issues that we see with that is, as an example, in Secretary Mattis's Pentagon photo, he's wearing a tie with the Constitution signers that are on his tie. And he's saying, I'm pledging this oath to the Constitution, yet he accepted a position for a president. You know, it's one of those things to really understand. This is truly something that is more political than really understanding. And, you know, it's commonly brought up that do the generals have the opportunity to be as political and kind of maneuver in that way? So I think it's important to understand how the allegiances work. And as you've seen kind of over history, and this time at least, it's more on the Republican side that you are seeing former generals being spotlighted and being put in situations that are used as legitimacy in ways that they otherwise shouldn't be. And on the last point, one of the things that was brought up immediately after the former chairman, Dunford, was retired, he was thought of, hey, we need him to be used as a way to be the ombudsman or to be the check and the inspector on the coronavirus situation with regards to the funding out of money. Why do we think as a society we should go to a military person for that and not somebody who was a state attorney general, not somebody who used to be a former auditor? You know, right away we're going to somebody as a matter of legitimacy, how they view and how they look at a problem instead of what their actual core competence is.
Great. Yeah, I think that rounds things out very nicely. Danny, you wanted to come in on this?
Yes, so just building off of Meg and Dan's comments, I think that this speaks to a broader issue, and we've kind of been dancing around this, but to speak to it more directly, I think that this also brings up broader trends, that this isn't just about Austin and his military experience. It's a broader conversation that we in the United States need to have about why we value military experience, why we have that deference, and why we have this broader veneration for the military. You know, certainly in Austin's case, incredibly distinguished military career. But when we think more broadly about, you know, bringing military veterans, and I use the term there very broadly to include, you know, those who served on active duty, but also National Guardsmen, et cetera, personnel, excuse me, et cetera, right? Is that I think we need to think about the fact that we immediately tend to give these candidates, for example, for office, incredible deference without thinking about the context their military experience differs, right? So this is different for the conversation for Austin, but I think it brings up this broader question about why do we value military experience so much and privilege it over other forms of experience? And a lot of that has to do with this integral notion of the veneration of the military and broader public trust and confidence in the military, which I know is something that I'm sure we'll get to a bit more later. But I think that, you know, one could potentially divorce these broader social current trends from the Austin nomination, but it's also really important to think about, you know, in the broader zeitgeist of like American public opinion and how we think about the military, that you do have this broader veneration that is difficult to separate.
Yeah, I think you bring up some interesting points, right? There's a conversation that could be had about, is this person called Lloyd Austin a good choice as an individual? There's a structural issue that says no general should ever fill that position ever. Doesn't matter who they are or how good they are. And then there's the third piece, which is to say, are we picking them, or do we have this preference for legitimacy gained through competence? Or is it actually kind of what Jessica was talking about? Are we actually picking them because they are not political, that we somehow like them because they are, you know, above the fray, and we'll just bring them in this one time to sort out this issue, not realizing, as Dan says, we're actually putting them into a highly charged political framework, and not only political, but by its very nature, personal and partisan, where the exact kind of deference we're giving them, we're actually inverting and expecting them to act very differently in that. So I think it's very difficult sometimes to parse those out in the cut and thrust of all this. And some people have said Austin's not a good choice because he doesn't have any experience in Asia. Other people are saying no generals ever, and other people are saying, are we picking this person for the right reasons? Jim, I'm going to give you the last word on this question before we move on. Go ahead, please.
Sure, thanks. I just want to build on one last thing that you said. And in addition to this veneration, one of the things that we don't always notice is that there are underlying partisan dynamics going on as well. And so one of the things that you have heard in this debate is, well, why can't Biden pick his general? Trump did that with Mattis. And I think that starts to be very dangerous when we start thinking about, it's one thing when we had President Trump saying, oh, these are my generals. It's another thing when we start to have Republican generals and Democratic generals, and when people in the force, whether they're cadets or soldiers or troops or other senior officers, see that their partisan behavior can be rewarded. And when you look this just 1 week ago, I think it really highlights the risk. If we had a partisan force that was loyal to President Trump rather than loyal to the Constitution, we could have a situation that was far more dangerous than what we actually had. So again, no one thinks that that's where we're headed in the next 2 to 4 years, but we do see troubling trends that are moving us more and more in that direction.
And that would have one kind of implication might be to push this kind of selection even further down the ranks, to identify good lieutenant colonels and good colonels who might make great SecDefs in the future, and see them aligning on one team or the other, which is not what we would like to see necessarily. The politicization of serving officers, as it were. I want to shift the focus a little bit, Dan, and go back to something very particular about Lloyd Austin himself. And that is, some have said, listen, we can put the civil military stuff aside for a minute because this is a historic nomination, because Lloyd Austin is would be the first African American to serve in the position as Secretary of Defense. Is that a big deal in the same way that the civil military relations aspects of this are a big deal? And if so, why? What about that, other than just being first, do we need to know more about?
Well, I think it is an incredibly big deal because representation matters, right? I mean, personnel is policy, and that's important. And all too often, minorities, whether women, but also people of color, are forgotten in the military and the civil dynamic. I mean, just to be blunt, the civil military relations community failed Lloyd Austin when his initial appointment was made, because everything was talked about, oh, wow, well, he's a general. But the word that we forgot about was, or the name that we forgot about was George Floyd. Right? So you had this racial reckoning over the summer, and then there were just these passing messages of, oh, well, he's the first, trailblazer, the first Black CENTCOM commander, the first Black Secretary of Defense, possibly, and that's great, but we never looked at it from an equity standpoint. We never truly understand what did it mean, right? So when you think about the military, we know that Black soldiers and Hispanic soldiers and soldiers of color and on the enlisted side overwhelmingly make up more than the officer side, right? And then when you think about, well, who serves in the Pentagon? You're having officers. So if you have all these white officers who are hand in hand with civilians working with policy, you don't really see a lot of Black or brown people who are serving in policy-related positions at the Pentagon, right? So one of the things too, even on the civil service side, it's actually at the GS 14 and 15, which are the senior leaders, career service folks, that's less than 10% that are Black. And then if you look at SESs at the Pentagon, it's less than 4%. So there really isn't any representation there that happens at all. And then as this was coming out, I was responding to people on Twitter, and then I found myself correcting reporters from big news agencies because they said, well, we've never had a Black nominee of any military department or otherwise. And I'm like, no. We've had two actually that were secretaries of the Army. You had one in Clifford Alexander in the Carter administration, and then we also had one in Togo West, who also became the Secretary of the VA under Clinton. And I'm having to write emails at 2 o'clock in the morning telling reporters to, hey, do a little bit more research, just go back to an entire generation. So I think it does mean a lot. And then when you think about from the civ mil aspect of it, in order for this to go through the process, it happens both from the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee, as we all know, through the HASC and the SASC kind of that we talk about this. And if you look at the representation even on that committee, right now, so actually in total, there's only been 2 Black senators that have ever served on the Senate Armed Service Committee. One was unelected because he filled Senator Obama's position when he became president. And then the other one was a senator from South Carolina, and he only served for about a year. So right now there is none. And then on the House side, there's only been two that has ever held leadership. One was a chairman back in the 103rd Congress, I believe. And then right now you have Anthony Brown, who's the vice chairman. And he's the only one. And there was an op-ed earlier that talked about that. And then if you go even more, so there's been no Black person who has served on the appropriations committees for defense on that subcommittee. So when you think about even the civil-mil relations, there's a representation gap and the equity gap. And then also when you consider kind of how this all works together, there's just something that needs to be the closing of the gap to say the military, not even the military, but the national security sector is open to more than just white men with military experience. It can't be lost that it took to get a Black person or a non-white male to be in the conversation, that they had to be a 4-star. And I think that's really which one of the problems is that there's these limits that occur on folks that otherwise don't exist for everybody else.
Right. So that the idea was that there's the bona fides of those 4 stars would make it okay to even be considered in that sense, where in the past we've had secretaries of defense who've been former senators, congresspeople, businessmen that have got their chops doing other jobs completely. That's an interesting perspective. Meg, you wanted to jump in on this?
I did want to jump in on this as somebody who has no former military experience, only having worked for the military, but I am a pure civilian. And what's also very interesting is if you look at the Pentagon's workforce and you look at the people of color that are at a GS 14, 15 level, often what you'll find is that they are actually retired military who on Friday have on their class A's as they're checking out, and on Monday have on a business suit because they're now a GS 14, 15, and in some cases SESs. What you don't find is many pure civilians. And I'm not saying that civilians have to be that, but who is a civilian when you have those equities in military services? And what you're finding is that with veterans preference, you're seeing a lot more of this within the Department of Defense. I see at program offices where you have people who've actually used this equipment and understand how it's used. I see that value of having that, but we are getting away from civilians having no military service and just, perhaps being trained in a host of different ways. But you see that as an issue. And what Dan brought up, when you start talking about the fact that over 43%, like about 43% of the 1.3 million active military members identify as people of color. And then when you look at the officer enlisted breakdown, it actually suggests some problematic things that have been so indicative with this country. Because when you look at the fact that they are overwhelmingly enlisted, it suggests that the value that the Department of Defense has of people of color is for their labor and not for their intellect on strategy and policy. And so that too is problematic. The Department of Defense has done little to focus on its civilian workforce and diversifying its civilian workforce, besides pulling people from the military after they have separated or retired. And that is problematic because particularly when you look at the OSD staff, the services do this better, but it's because they're pulling their own often and having them work on service staffs. But if you look at OSD staff, there are very few Black or brown people or otherwise, underrepresented minorities across the board in terms of those who are otherwise able and other such things who work on OSD staff. And that is where policy happens in the Pentagon. That is where resources are allocated, justified, and executed. So that is, when you're talking about representation matters, there is very little representation of people of color on OSD staff.
I think that's a great point to show that, just looking at numbers, which often DoD will trot out saying we've got X amount of percentage here, there, and everywhere else. It doesn't actually talk about where those people are in the hierarchy, and that makes an enormous difference. And that's one of the reasons why perhaps Lloyd Austin is a unique case in that he has been able to make it through those various command levels and represent somebody who at least within the military, has done those kinds of representative jobs and could perhaps be a good reason to bring over. Jim, you wanted to come in on this?
Sure, thanks. I just want to emphasize, this is a huge long-term structural cultural problem that we need to urgently address. And it's not, it's not the sort of thing that, regardless of whether Austin is confirmed or not, it's not going to be solved by his nomination, but it can help. If he is confirmed, it will send a much bigger message. But as Dan has pointed out, as Meg has pointed out, there are huge problems in recruiting the right people and helping them get through individual choke points, in mentorship, from white officers or other white national security folks who are identifying that talent and help pull it up. And I just want to emphasize that if Trump had not violated this norm 4 years ago, there's a good chance that Austin wouldn't even have been considered. But that's an even bigger, I think, black eye for us when we look at the national security workforce. If we have to say we can't identify, strong candidates unless we go to the military, I think that's something we have to do better on, both within the military and within the broader national security workforce.
Great points. Jess?
Just one very quick addition to the excellent points that have already been made. I think we've had a tendency in this discussion to try to sort of separate and silo the civil military relations issues from the representation issues. To some extent, for understandable reasons, when we're talking about the Secretary of Defense, we tend to focus sort of narrowly on the civilian control and workings of government part of civil military relations. But civil military relations concerns, as we've already touched on with some of these things about the relationship between society and the military and veneration of the military, are much broader than that and are very tightly linked to issues of representation and identity. So I think it's important to remember that we can't fully separate those discussions. They have to go together.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is about armed forces, the state, and society as being the three pieces of the puzzle. Dan, you wanted to come in, and then we'll go on to another question.
Yeah, I think just to close out, just got to hammer home the point that Jim was saying. At the end of the day, diversity is a national security issue, period, right? Because in 2045, we have to think about what's going to happen when white Americans are no longer considered the majority. And then if we're not building a diverse generation now, how is that actually going to clash if we're not starting to have the conversations about race, identity, ethnicity, and how people belong in the military and the use of force? Because what if you have an all-white officer corps or an all-white officer corps that's making policy, and then you have constituents who are mostly Black and brown, and then you have elected officials who are representative of the constituents and not of the militaries? There's going to be friction there, and we know that. We saw it. We've seen it throughout history, and we know that it's going to happen. So I think we've kind of been beyond the conversation, and now there needs to be something finite that's in there and descriptive. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see it identified as in the national security strategy or in the national defense strategy, because it's something that we do have to consider.
Great point. Thanks for that. I don't want to move too far away from this, but Danny, many have observed that civil military relations are in bad shape in America, and it's time to repair those. It's time to restore, amongst other things, trust, morale in the military, but also within and between the civilian leadership in the military. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, is Austin the person to achieve that?
So to the first point of whether or not it's a fair assessment, yes and no, which is very helpful, I realize. Speaking in terms of public perceptions of the military, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there's two issues going on here. One, of all the institutions in the United States, the military is often consistently regarded with the most public trust and public confidence. So there isn't necessarily a big gap there, particularly when you compare it to other institutions like Congress, et cetera. But also though, when you poll people and you ask them about which professions do they trust, the military ranks very highly up there with doctors, teachers, et cetera. But there is also a partisan dimension here that is really important. So for example, research by Burbach shows that trust in both the White House and also in the military has a lot to do with whether or not your party is in power, right? So there are these broader social trends there. The question about the relationship more broadly between the different pillars of government, right? If we can think about government versus, civilians in the government versus, the military. That's a bit trickier in the sense that we don't have quite as clear public opinion data on that in the same way that we do about public, I'm being repetitive, my apologies, as public opinion data. But that actually, I think, is probably where those interpersonal relationships are most important, right? So to say that, could Austin fix that? Well, perhaps, right? Perhaps if you have a Secretary of Defense who respects their role as SecDef, but also respects the role, for example, of the Secretary of State, right? If we think about bureaucratic politics and bureaucratic infighting that we often see, case in point, for example, the George W. Bush administration and what happened going into Iraq, right? So that's a place where those individuals, I think, can be really important. But I think to put the onus on one person to try to fix civil military relations, either at that broader public level in terms of the partisan dimension, or that deeper within, between the different branches or ways of thinking about the military, it's just really unfair. Not that you're doing that, Chris, right? But I have heard these arguments be made, right? That's just too much to put on one person's shoulders. I think this also actually relates really well to our prior conversation about thinking about diversity in the military, in the sense that we need to have these broader conversations about these broader structural issues underlying these problems. Now, the diversity in the military issue and the lack of diversity, particularly at the officer ranks, might have a different structural cause than some of the structural issues we're seeing here about the breakdown or the erosion of civil military relations in the United States. But in both cases, we need to look at these broader structural causes for why we see this breakdown happening. But certainly I would argue that at the public level, there isn't as much concern there, but it really is more about these interpersonal relationships that really matter.
Let me go off of that, because that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask next. Is that, the last SecDef who was a retired general officer was Jim Mattis, and he was criticized for sidestepping the civilian staff at the office of the SecDef, amongst other things, being reluctant to engage with the press, for example, was another one. Maybe I'll just open this up to Jim and then ask anyone else who wants to come in. Do you see that these similar kinds of things would be endemic to a general officer like Austin, or would we see enough of a difference in the personality that we might not see that same kind of problem? Would there be a learning effect from the last time that might help Austin overcome these kinds of issues? Jim, I'll go to you first, but then anyone else who wants to jump in.
Thanks. Yeah, and I've written on this a lot before. I'll just flag my War on the Rocks piece that sort of examined Mattis's tenure in terms of civil relations is a good place to sort of look at that broader argument. I think in terms of the learning curve, hopefully, but I do think that there are some habits, some states of mind that develop over 4 decades in the military in terms of what your experiences are, what your priorities are, how you interact with people, who your networks are. I mean, I think that's one of the things, as I try to think about, even after being out of the military for a little over half a year now, my network is changing in very fundamental ways. And the people I interact with, the people I go to for advice are different even now, just after, half a year or so. So all of those things, I think, matter. Now, one of the things that I think we see that is positive is we do see some strong civilian appointments. We've seen Kath Hicks as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Colin Call as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and Kelly Magsamen as the Chief of Staff for the Secretary of Defense. And also I'll point out conflict of interest. I've worked for both Kath and Colin. I think they're phenomenal, but that should just be out there that I have a bias toward them. So we've seen at least one step that they've taken to try to correct for Mattis, who surrounded him a little bit too much with other military officers who would hamper that. But I would say there are a few things that he's going to have to think hard about and that won't come naturally, that hopefully he can learn from and hopefully he's paying attention to. One is that military officers focus a lot more on strategy than budgets. And so we had what many people consider a great national defense strategy under Jim Mattis, but much less attention on the budget, and the budget lives on after you're gone. The strategy usually doesn't. So he needs to pay very careful attention to that. He also needs to work really hard to be transparent and to develop, the persona as the face of the Department of Defense, the person who sells the policies, the person who explains the policies, the person who stands up and takes the political hits when things aren't going well, the person who has, regular press conferences. That's something I think he could learn from, but it's not going to come naturally to him at all based on his personality and characteristics from what we know. So I think we've seen some potential learning and some steps that hopefully are in the right direction, but it is a learning curve and it is a different experience than he will have had in the past.
Great points. Danny, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one additional factor that I don't think has gotten quite as much traction in the broader conversation about the Austin nomination, and that is the importance of presidential style. One element that we might not actually know quite a lot about yet is what is Biden's kind of management style going to be? In the foreign policy analysis literature, we call this some exemplary types of this, for example, would be things like, are they a delegatory CEO style? Are they micromanager, et cetera, right? And so part of how this can come into the broader conversation on CMR is that if you have a president who preferences one of their advisors over others, that might affect the balance of civil-military relations. Certainly we saw this during the Trump administration in a negative way in terms of harming norms of civilian control. We can also think here about what is the relationship between the different presidential advisors or different parts of the executive branch going to be? Is Austin going to have, a competitive relationship with other secretaries, which I think is actually quite unlikely given the way the cabinet is forming, or is he going to have a more complementary relationship? And also, how much freedom are these secretaries going to be given over their domains? Right? These are important parts of the conversation that can affect the broader impact of any one secretary, as well as how civil-military relations take shape under the Biden administration. And I just don't think we quite have enough information there yet to make a determination.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I wanted to segue a little bit off that, which is to say, a lot has been made about how Biden trusts Lloyd Austin. He's worked with him before, and he is said to trust him. Jess, and maybe Meg could come in on this too. Do you think that in and of itself should be the kind of sine qua non, and maybe that's enough to say, well, if he's got the president's trust, then we can live with it, and all of the other kinds of considerations should be secondary to that?
Meg, you go first.
I would definitely say that's not enough. There are certain things that have to happen. I think Jim raised the point about some of these responsibilities. However, I would like to really highlight some of the testimony that Dr. Khan, Lindsey Khan, and Dr. Kathleen McKinnon had yesterday before the Senate Armed Services Committee, where they were very specific about saying there are very few people who are uniquely qualified to walk into the role of Secretary of Defense and do it, do all the responsibilities, the whole host of responsibilities. It is a steep learning curve for everyone who assumes that position. However, I do think that, whether or not Austin is the best person for the job, if we assume that he is walking in what he must do, budgetary concerns are huge concerns. He had some of that responsibility when he was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. But that being said, when you're looking across all of DOD's equities, it becomes an enormous responsibility. Whomever is his comptroller, he will have to develop a very good relationship with that person, and as well as not just the Armed Services Committees, but Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee and House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee. These will be critical committees that he will have to testify in front of, and that's just something he would never have had to do as in the roles that he had in terms of Vice Chief of Staff, Combatant Command, or Theater Command. But it is like this for everyone. Even if a civilian walked in and was highly qualified, these are unique circumstances. The role of the Secretary of Defense is a unique job, and that is something that is going to be across the board. There are people who would do it better than others, but I think it's something to consider that this is not something that nobody can walk in and do all these things well.
Fair enough, and very few people get a chance to do it twice, Rumsfelds of the world notwithstanding, right? Jess, you wanted to come in here?
Sure, just quickly to pick up on the points that Danny and Meg have made about the role of individual relationships, both up and down, and Chris, to your question about trust. I do think it's extremely important that President-elect Biden seems to trust Austin, and that seems to be a key motivation for this nomination, and something that's common among a number of Biden's nominations is that these are people that he knows and trusts from previous experience. And as Danny alluded to with the sort of foreign policy analysis literature, this matters, the relationship between the president and his advisors and between the advisors, but I certainly don't think that alleviates the civil military relations concerns, given the concerns that we've laid out. I haven't really heard anyone expressing the concern that sort of the issue is that the Secretary of Defense is just going to go rogue and not obey the president and do what they want. That's not the civ mil concern that's been expressed. If that were the issue, then Biden trusting him would make me feel better about that, I guess. But given the underlying broader concerns, and particularly about the erosion of norms, the fact that Biden has basically said, this person is the person I trust largely because of their military experience, it kind of reinforces that perception that the military experience is what earns you the trust.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for that. Jim and then Dan.
Great. Yeah, I also just wanted to emphasize that one of the things that'll be really important isn't just the trust between, assuming Secretary Austin gets confirmed, between him and President-elect Biden. It's also with the other advisors. And the one note of caution I'd point out there is that there's a very close team coming in. You have, former Secretary Kerry coming in a climate role, with his former deputy secretary coming in as the Secretary of State. You have Jake Sullivan at the NSC. You have Colin Kahl as the Undersecretary for Policy in the Pentagon. You have all these people with very close relationships. And so I think it's incumbent both on Austin to try to build those relationships and that trust, as well as those people to really open up and make sure that they're not having conversations after a PC or an NSC meeting and not pulling him in. And so I think building that broader network of trust is probably more important than just the SecDef president relationship, because he's going to interact with those people a lot more than he interacts with the president.
Yeah, those are great points. And again, it's not just, it's difficult for anybody, but it's maybe a bit of a different sense that this is the old team getting back together again. And regardless of who it might have been, if you're the other person out there, it'll be difficult to have to break in and make sure you stay inside that loop. Dan?
I think the last thing I would say is that just remember that, being the President Biden-elect, kind of can choose his own cabinet. It is his prerogative to pick who he wants. Right. And I think we do need to remind him that the other side of the civilian control is not only the executive branch, but is in this legislature. Right. So we do need to kind of give the president, particularly their leeway in terms of who they feel best fits on their team. So I think there is some of that they still have to make it through the confirmation process.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's why I think, it's good that we're having this panel now. We can all be wrong in 2 weeks if it turns out that that doesn't happen. I wanted to move to that question and ask both Jess and Dan, and then Daniel, and anyone else who wants to come in, Danielle, if anyone else wants to come in. Does it make a difference now that we're starting to see more military, either veterans or even in many cases reservists, serving in the legislative side? Does this somehow change perhaps the way civil military relations work, and maybe make that having a former military officer as SecDef somehow less problematic than we might expect? maybe go to Jess first and then Danny.
I was going to defer to Danny on this, and then
Okay,
I'll pick up.
Danny first and then Jess.
Yeah, so I would actually respectfully push back on the notion that we have more veterans serving in the US, well, certainly in the US Congress. That's my area of expertise. We've actually seen a mass decline in the number of veterans. The good news is we've actually seen an increase in the diversity of what that service looks like, not just in terms of ascriptive diversity, in terms of who these individuals are, right, but also in terms of what their service capacities were, and there's quite a lot of variety there. Individually, it matters. My research shows that individually, yes, veterans who serve in Congress, for example, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, were more willing to exert oversight over the conduct of those wars. But the question is, what's kind of the broader substantive effect? And there's not a lot of evidence necessarily that those individuals have kind of a broader, mass wave effect on how Congress or their particular parties view and vote on specific issues. There is strong evidence from work by people like Jeremy Tigan, for example, that shows that political candidates who have military service are viewed as more credible on foreign and defense policy, but the catch is they're not necessarily actually more likely to be voted into office. So veterans don't actually have an electoral advantage. So we could argue that at the individual level, yes, it does matter. But I think more broadly, the question of, what is the broader effect substantively on policy is it's actually quite small. But also I think, Chris, your question about, what does this mean for the norm? Very careful and cautious to make this argument about how we normalize veterans in Congress. Jess, I know you'll probably speak in a moment about active people who are currently reservists, so I'll leave it to you, right? But I do think that this broader question, again, to tie it back to this notion of why do we value military service so much, right? And I don't say this to poo-poo military service. I have incredible respect for those in uniform. Both my parents are veterans, and so I think it's this bigger question about, why is it that one who has served in the military is viewed as more credible in foreign and defense policy, even if one just served for, let's say, one contract and then left, right? Why does that have more experience? And this, I think, also ties back to some of Meg's comments earlier, about civilian versus veterans in the Pentagon, right? So I think there's that broader issue there. The trends don't look great in terms of in terms of veterans more broadly as political candidates. This last cycle was rather disappointing in those terms. And so I would give us a word of caution there. But Jess, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. So yes, I think that in terms of the sort of oversight question of does this make us worry less? Maybe, in that, based on Danny's research, we have some evidence that it's possible that members of Congress who are veterans would feel more comfortable sort of questioning or pushing back on a Secretary of Defense who happens to be a retired general in ways that others might not be, right? John McCain was sort of famous for being the one who was not afraid to ask the hard questions of the military because he could. He had sort of the political capital to do that. But again, to the broader trends, I think that's where there's a bigger question of if the trend is just more and more that for all things military experience or expertise is kind of a qualification, that's potentially concerning. And then to the politicization issue that's sort of been raised too, both in the Secretary of Defense appointment of sort of, does this becoming kind of regularly a military position make it kind of the actual end cap of your military career and therefore create political incentives down the chain? Similarly, we just kind of see that, as Danny was alluding to, the blurring of the lines as members of the military or former members of the military, so reservists and members of the Guard and veterans get involved in these political roles. When they do so in ways that blur the line, by really dramatically emphasizing their military expertise, particularly when they're still in the military, then that kind of further blurs public perceptions of who is in the military and who isn't. And just to circle back to some things that Jim said about Mattis's tenure, again, we saw that there where it seemed like even Mattis himself wasn't totally clear on whether he was acting as a retired general first or as a civilian political appointee. And that further blurs the distinctions for the public.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to cap that off. Before we go to the audience questions, which we'll do in just a second, I wanted to ask kind of the inverse of the representation question, which I think needs to be addressed, which is, certainly over the last week, but for longer than that, we've seen that, there are elements of the right wing and white supremacist people who have espoused those values within the military, and how large and how much of a problem that may be, we're starting to perhaps take a more serious look at now. Do you think that poses a special challenge to Lloyd Austin, Dan?
Well, I think it is a challenge. I think he might be more understanding, or at least have some more background in it, because he was a Black man who integrated schools when he was growing up, right? I mean, to think about it, we are not that far away. The fact that my father is older than Ruby Bridges, when we think about it, just to understand how does that desegregation look, that, there are still, freedom riders, rest in peace, John Lewis, who were elected to Congress and were still alive. So I think he probably will understand the sentiment a bit more just based on his experience. I mean, I can, know that, my time at West Point in the Army, there were racial incidents that did occur, and, white nationalism is an issue. But I also think now it's becoming a national issue. And I think that's what's important. It is in the purview of the Secretary of Defense to understand how is the health of the force, right? And how is everybody aligning to the same values and being true to the Constitution? I mean, one of the things that I was a bit disappointed about was the fact that it took almost an entire week for uniform members to come up with a one-page document to say, yes, this was an attack on the Constitution, right? And it was definitely more of them saying, hey, let's not do anything until the last possible minute to really talk about that oath. But I also think that it's not just the Secretary of Defense who has something to do with, but also it's the Department of Justice, right? Also, it's understanding that we do have particular domestic tools at our disposal to ensure that these individuals, whether they're filling out their SF-86 or whatnot, aren't going to then hold these security clearances. But I think although he might understand it, or at least have some personal experience in it, I think it's more than just to put the weight on his shoulders because he's possibly the first Black Secretary of Defense, but also it's really, I would say, more on the purview and from accountability side on the Department of Justice.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, trying to put all of the problems, whatever those problems are, at the feet of any one individual is, as we've, I think, plumbed quite well tonight, overwhelming. Before we go to questions, I'll give Danny the last word.
Oh, goodness, I didn't mean to take the last word. I just wanted to give a little bit of context in case it's helpful for the viewers out there in the webinar. So a 2019 Military Times poll indicated that over a third of respondents, granted there are some sampling issues, but that over a third of respondents to their poll had indicated that they had experienced or witnessed some kind of act of white supremacy or white nationalism within the military. And that was up from about 20%, I believe 22% is the actual number the year before. So that's a pretty sharp rise. There's actually recent research from Spindell, Ralston, and Mata on this particular issue, including a great piece in the conversation talking about how prevalent is white nationalism. I think a lot of the public was shocked. But I think to echo Dan's comments, they probably shouldn't have been, just given overall trends. But I certainly didn't mean to take the last word here on this, particularly on this issue.
It won't be the last word of the whole night. We've got some great questions that I'm going to start throwing out. So when I throw them out there, by all means, if you've got other things you want to add on that haven't been said, throw that out there. There's a great question here. It says, does having a retired general as SecDef lessen the weight of best military advice that might come from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? In other words, do you feel that there's a potential for President-elect Biden to defer to Austin with regards to military advice and perhaps not bother to go and ask another general if he's already got that coming from Austin? Let me go to Meg to start with, and then I'll flip that over to Jim.
I think this is something that several civil scholars have raised as a primary concern is lanes in the road. Your job is the job of someone as Secretary of Defense is not to provide best military advice. That is the Joint Staff. So he is no, like if Mr. Austin were to become the Secretary of Defense, he is no longer General Austin. He is Mr. Austin, and you have an entire staff. You have an entire joint staff that will provide the president that it falls outside of the chain of command to the president. That being said, a lot of this, and if we use Mr. Mattis as the example, is you managing your boss as well and saying, oh, sir, in this case would be President-elect Biden, you need to, you'll want to talk to whomever the chairman is at the time. Right now, it'd be like, you need to talk to General Milley, or bringing General Milley into that discussion and not just answering the question or addressing the issue as a retired general officer. Know your role and stay within it, because I think that is something that we saw with Mr. Mattis that became problematic. And I think that's the legitimate concern that many civil scholars have raised time and time again, is having, will that be able to, will his default position as a general officer within the United States Army be something he can push against? And we don't know that. I will say this, I know very little about Mr. Austin, but it's not been my job to follow. That's not been my job for the last several years to know this. I think a lot of this is conjecture about what would have to happen, but these are legitimate discussions that have to take place and questions that need to be answered.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, a lot of that, as we mentioned, some of these concerns are theoretical or conceptual. Some of them are worried based on what we've seen from experience with what we may have seen with Jim Mattis. I think I said I would go to Jim on this, and then Dan would like to come in.
Sure. I just want to focus, we can focus on the relationship between President-elect Biden and Mr. Austin. And I think that is an important dynamic, but it's also important to remember that military advice is not the product of one person and what comes out of them. So I think we have to pay very close attention. And I hope if he's confirmed, Mr. Austin pays very close attention to the health of his civilian workforce in OSD writ large, in OSD policy in particular, because there's been a lot of atrophy in the oversight processes, in the personnel management, over not really just the last 4 years, but probably over the last 8. And this was something that in 2019, the Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission highlighted as a concern, that in fact, we were relying too much on the Joint Staff and not enough on civilian management. And so I think, the next Secretary of Defense is going to come in with the need to rebuild those processes if they want to be able to have their own independent role as a civilian advisor, as the Secretary of Defense, and not simply falling back on just going to the military staff because it's easy. And so I think that's a challenge where, while it may at first seem like those will be different, I think Austin has to make sure that he builds a staff and builds the processes so that his role as Secretary of Defense is different than what you're getting from the Joint Staff.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think it's not just easy, it's familiar, I think is the worry, right? That you would go with what you're familiar with. So you might just go to somebody with a letter and a number in their title because you know what they do, as opposed to an OSD staff that you may have to build or don't have those kinds of relationships with. Dan, you wanted to come in on this?
I think one of the other things too to understand that the BMA or best military advice can also be usurped through the National Security Advisor. So one of the big things that I'm kind of a staunch, an ardent heretic or whatever you want to call it, maybe non-supporter of, is the fact that active duty military folks are authorized to serve as a national security advisor. And one of those things is that really blurs the line, because that's the one position where the president can choose an active duty person who then can serve with them and still wear the uniform every day and act in that manner. It's a highly politicized role. So one of the things is we should try to make sure that also you don't have an NSA who is active duty at all, unless the Senate or Congress writ large has an opportunity to confirm them, because that's that special relationship that, Congress doesn't have to say anything to that. So I think we should kind of see, we saw how it played out with H.R. McMaster. and how he kind of pivoted and tried to work with that and would wear civilian clothes. And we also saw even previously with Secretary Powell, in his case, it was like, how do you go from National Security Advisor to then the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, to then the Secretary of State? You can draw those lines to know that there was political partisan capital that was gained from that. It was there because he was a national security advisor under Republican administration, and then also a Secretary of State confirmed under Republican administration as well. So then we kind of have to look at that NSA job really seriously to understand, do we want to usurp not only the best military advice we have active duty folk, but also usurp the civil control from the Senate if you have a uniformed member there.
No, I think that's a great point, that sometimes the numbers kind of, don't necessarily tell the whole story. And as Jim said, there aren't any other civilians in the chain of command. So if you have another general, albeit a recently retired one, you are really starting to change the character of that civilian aspect of civilian control of the military. And when you start talking about service secretaries, some of whom also have military backgrounds, you can really start to modify, we'll say, and to try to be as neutral as possible, modify what that civilian input into that larger process, which if every other person is military or former military, how much are you really getting in terms of what, as has been said, the framers of the national defense apparatus really were looking for in terms of having balances and a diversity of thought and experience. Now, I have to say, some of the people who are asking questions are writing tomes, and it's very difficult to boil down what they might be and not ignore what you guys are all answering. But the one of them that I'm going to kind of paraphrase is, isn't this just another example of the blob trying to make sure that we get the usual suspects into positions by keeping military people out? Therefore, we kind of keep this continuity of the same old civilians who are experts, who have this background. They all went to the same schools, and it's just a way of making sure that that is an unbroken, blob / swamp type environment. Jess, and then I see Danny is kind of smiling, so I'll ask her.
Oh boy. Okay. So I guess I'll start by saying that I just think it's really interesting that in the American context, when we kind of talk about these ideas of the blob or the deep state or things like that, we tend to not include the military, where in a lot of other contexts, the military would very much be included as part of that blob, which I think gets at some of the underlying dynamics that we've already talked about how there already is very much a tendency to sort of elevate military service in a particular way as being particularly noble and motivated by good things and something we should respect, while at the same time denigrating a lot of other types of public service, including career public service on the civil side, whether that's in civil servant roles, in political appointee roles, or some combination thereof. So I think that's just sort of an underlying dynamic that we separate those in particular ways. I don't know that I can really specifically answer the question. I mean, I can say that I know at least.
I think the question was provocative, and I was trying to make it even more provocative. And let me turn up the provocation up one more twist. People are quite happy to see career diplomats, for example, get appointed as secretaries of state, or in this case, nominated to be the director of the CIA. Why would we not be so concerned about that? Why shouldn't we be worried about capturing, an ambassador capturing a post in the same way that we might be concerned a general is capturing the post? Is there a category difference there, or is it really just the same thing, Danny?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're not afraid of this, potentially, of the State Department, launching a coup. I mean, the military is a unique, and that came across more flippant as I meant it to do. I meant that very seriously, right? At the end of the day, the reason why we have norms of civilian control is because the military is a apparatus that has the possibility to overturn and undermine federally elected government, right? The military is categorically different, right? To the broader question of, is this just a case of, people saying one thing, but really, meaning another? I really think that it's critically important to take people at their word, right? So if people are saying, I am opposed to this nomination because of X issue, or I support this nomination because of X issue, right? There is not a deeper hidden meaning there, right? And if you want to talk about representation more broadly in the federal government, I just pulled up the statistics here. In 2014, military veterans made up almost 31% of the federal workforce. Think about the number of military veterans that we have in the United States more broadly, right? They might be underrepresented, quote unquote, in Congress, but they're overrepresented more broadly in the federal workforce, right? So those would kind of be, my three takes to that, responses to that question.
No, you're absolutely right. This is Samuel Finer's kind of line, right? Why should we treat the military differently? Because they have guns, right? They're not the same. They're not civil servants. They are something different, a category apart. Absolutely. Somebody should put together a reader with the classics of civil military relations theory in there, so people don't lose sight of that. Absolutely. Jim, you wanted to come in on this?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just jump in, and I think part of this speaks to the question of that's been floating around, and I'll just throw it out there: this concern that people are misrepresenting their positions because they would have wanted Michelle Flournoy to get the position. I'm on the record for about a decade on this issue of civilian control and the concerns. So I find that a little bit laughable in some cases. But what I do want to point out is that all of the other candidates who were up for the role, one was Michelle Flournoy, who, if nominated, would have been the first female nomination to the job. So again, it's hard to say that's the normal blob because it would have been something extremely rare. You also had Senator Tammy Duckworth, who would have been path-breaking in multiple ways if she'd been named. And then you had Jay Johnson, who, out of those, it's hard to say that that's just, the blob getting their way. And so, I understand the criticism, but I do think there are some deeper concerns at stake with having another retired general do this, especially, one administration after the next, in a way that makes this seem like this will just become normal, and it's not something that we need to worry about.
Yeah, I think that's fair comment. Meg, and then Danny.
I'd like to add in and jump onto this misrepresentation situation, because I think this is something that I've written about a bit with respect to this nomination. I think what was troubling to me was not like it should have been this person, it should have been that person. It's when the nomination was made, there was a lot of conversation about, well, all women in national security, feel betrayed and things like that. And for me, that left me behind. And so I had to speak up, because not only am I a woman, as you can see, I am also a Black woman. So when I looked at this situation, it was yet again kind of like, early part of, the 20th century, where it was like, okay, you're forgetting about, Black women and Black people. I mean, there were very specific instances of people, referring to Mr. Austin as not ineligible because he needed a waiver, but unqualified. And I was just kind of like, okay, if this were in 5 years when he actually had passed that point, would you have still said he was unqualified? And I think what was really frustrating was, because for me, I actually thought that Michelle Flournoy would be the nominee. And so I was just kind of like, I would have been very happy if it were a woman. I would have been, in many respects, I wasn't going to not be happy that it was Mr. Austin also. So I think that was something that needed to be clarified, that it wasn't necessarily, oh, I wanted it, certain people were misrepresenting what they were saying based on, oh, it wasn't a woman, or it was this, or what, it was this person, the demographic profile. I think what was really frustrating at times was people doubting the diversity that Mr. Austin brought to the job because he was military, when in fact he brings an element of diversity that the department writ large hasn't seen. We've moved from the Montfort Point Marines, who were fighting just for the right to fight, to someone like Mr. Austin even being nominated. And I think that is something that actually just has to be recognized. Whether or not he is the best person for the job, it's the acknowledgement of really how the department has transitioned, but it's also the issue where if you look at the depth, like the lack of depth of the bench, where we haven't seen we have seen so few people of color as Senate confirmed nominees. So few people, where women have done better, but that's still problematic. We have a long way to go in the national security community writ large. And I think, Jim and Danny both brought it up. We cannot fight over, well, what you really mean is this. No, people are saying what they're saying, believe it, accept it, move on. We don't have time for this infighting. Like, that's ridiculous at this point.
Yeah, I think that thanks for sharing that the personal dimension of that too. I think it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. This is going to be the final words to Jesse and Danny, and unless anyone else wants to chime in, but that's what my batting order is. So Jess first, and then Danny.
Sure, just really quick. First, I want to echo just that I do think a really frustrating aspect of this has been the sort of let's make the diversities compete against each other aspect of it, which is just not super productive, I don't think, in all the ways that Meg just described. But also just to this point, I do think it says a lot that a number of people who are raising concerns from a Civ Mill perspective raised the same concerns when Mattis was nominated, and when the alternatives were very much not people they would have been comfortable with as part of the blob, which I do think speaks to the fact that there are underlying concerns there.
Yeah, and
all right, Danny. You said you didn't want the last word, but you've got it anyway.
I realized I bit myself on that one. Yeah, so I think Meg and Jess have it spot on. I'll add one thing, right? So this is not a competition. The fact that in the discourse, some feminists have framed this as a competition is incredibly unhealthy, and I would argue regressive to moving forward on this issue. The fact that this has been framed as a competition between underrepresented groups, I think just really amplifies and highlights the need to address the structural conditions that are leading us to even be having this conversation in the first place, right? I hope that moving forward, we will not be having the same kind of conversation. And as Jess and Dan and Jim, I believe, also pointed out earlier, right? One cannot, I don't think, necessarily divorce the underlying concerns about civil military relations norms with this broader issue of representation. So that would be my pitch for the last word and my main takeaway.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And let me close just by thanking everybody for coming. It's always great to have a strong audience participation. Sorry for the questions we couldn't get to. I tried to amalgamate as many as I could. I think we had a fantastic discussion tonight that raised some seriously important issues on the civil military relations side, which is not, I don't believe, the province only of a codified civil military guild. It is a concern, or should be a concern, for everyone, not just academic specialists, but also some serious insights into issues about representation and how this is not an either or type discussion. We can have talks about competency and representation and equity and civil military relations at the same time without having to compete. So thank you very much for everybody who shared their research and their personal insights. I also want to thank Michelle D'Amico and Casey Forrest and the entire CGA team for the work behind the scenes. None of this could happen without them. Thanks to our co-host, the Clements Center. And I would ask that you all join me in thanking our panelists for their generous use of their time and their insight tonight. Although it's silent, you can just imagine the applause peeling off the rafters. And for my part, I'd like to wish Lloyd Austin the very best of luck in his role as the Secretary of Defense. I'm sure he will be a fine choice and do, as has been mentioned here, the best that any one individual could be expected to do, and by no means should the weight of too many worlds be put on that one individual's shoulders, goodness knows his to-do list on day one will be enormous in both length and gravity. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Again, to the panelists, I owe you one, whatever that means. You can hit me up for whatever it is you need. And to the audience, thanks again. Have a great night.